I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we take a closer look at the federal political landscape through a pollster's eyes. The people of Canada elected a minority Liberal government, and now, poof, we have a majority government. Are people happy with that? I've always found in my research that polls give us a snapshot of where we are and what people are thinking at a given moment in time. Obviously, they're not perfect. But if you use them looking for trends or changes, they can be useful. So, some questions. With a new majority Liberal government in Ottawa, what has changed in the business of governing Canada, if anything? I assume there won't be much patience for more words and speeches. People will now expect some action. Does this bare majority seem rock solid? How do people feel about budget overruns, or do they even care? Now that an imminent election seems off the table, does Mr. Poilievre's position seem diminished? Is his leadership of the Conservative Party secure? And what are the top-of-mind issues for Canadians? And who are the influencers behind the scenes whose voices leaders choose to listen to? And how is that trump card playing now? Here's a loaded question. What do Canadians think of floor crossers and their ability to create a majority government when none existed after the election? I always have a lot of questions. So for some guidance on these issues, I've asked Mario Canseco of Research Co. to join me and provide some factual context. Again, this is just a moment in time, but it's a really interesting moment in time. Back after this break. Mario, you sure know how to pick a profession that's boring.
Yes, there's never a dull moment in this business.
Being a political pollster, especially in Canada, is interesting, shall we say. So, can I ask you if you think that everything is settled down in federal politics now that we have a majority?
Well, it settles down in a way because there's not going to be a concerted effort to try to bring down the government now. There's still a lot to be defined. I think part of it is going to have to deal with what happens in the Quebec election, if there's going to be a rebirth of separatism that could get the Bloc to have a higher level of support. What happens with the NDP under the new leader, Abby Lewis? Are they going to be able to get some of those votes that they lost to Mark Carney in the 2025 election? But it's also a battle for the soul of the Conservatives. Discussions about what to do. Is this the leader that you want to carry on until the next election, even though he was just ratified? And for Mark Carney, I mean, as long as there's Donald Trump saying something or tweeting something every couple of weeks, there's an opportunity to reconnect with the base of the party. So it's settled in the sense that nobody's going to try to break it, but it's tough to tell where this will go.
So let's look at what we've got here. We elected a minority government, and now we've got a majority. How do you think Canadians are feeling about this new majority government?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors at play. It's something that all political parties have done at some point. With the Conservatives also were poaching people from the Liberal Party at some stages. We've seen it happen in other jurisdictions. We've never seen it happen at this rate. I think that is also something that needs to be said. You don't just figure it out and essentially try to get somebody from other parties to join you in order to have the majority that you didn't get through the ballot box. But I think it's also something that speaks about the lack of cohesion in the Conservative caucus. If you're somebody who campaigned under Pierre Poilievre, who won your seat under Pierre Poilievre, and then suddenly a few months later decide that you want to go, this has more to do with the leadership of the federal Conservatives than whatever the Liberals are dangling in front of you.
I understand that it's part of our history and it's proper to do it, but I really feel when you make a switch like that, I think you should have to go to a by-election because you somebody didn't just vote for me, they voted for whatever party I was associated with. And you can't just go over here now. And I guess nobody's talking about actually doing that, but I think that would be the right thing to do.
Well, I think it would be a good idea to try to implement it in a way. Part of what happens is, depending on the flavor of the month, you might find people who say, well, you vote for the person, and if the person wants to switch parties, that's fine. But when we ask Canadians, how do you decide how you vote in federal elections? Most people gravitate towards the party or the leader. There's very few who say, I'm voting for this person because I know this person, and if this person were running as a candidate for the Marxist-Leninist Party, I would still vote for this person. And that's just not the case. You know, there's a lot of identification that happens with the leader. I think there's no better example of this than 2025, when you had so many long-term incumbents from the NDP suddenly losing their seats because people were afraid of what Donald Trump was going to do unless Mark Carney formed the government.
Have you done any polling on what people think of this new majority? Is it too soon?
I think it's too soon. And, you know, part of what we're seeing is a change in the way people look at the federal Conservatives. I think there was a moment, especially if you go back to the final weeks of 2024, when a majority government seemed inevitable. Justin Trudeau was still supposedly going to stay, and then everything changes on Epiphany Day of all days, on January 6th. Justin Trudeau decides that he wants to go. Mark Carney comes in. It becomes more complicated for the Conservatives to run the campaign they had prepared, which was a campaign against Justin Trudeau. But it really hasn't enabled Pierre Poilievre with an opportunity to grow his base. You know, he had a remarkable result when you compare it with what other leaders had done for the Conservatives, but it's not enough to win. And what we've seen over the past couple of months is trying to talk to the same people that are already with you, going to the UFC fight in Winnipeg, going to Joe Rogan's podcast. The voters that have abandoned the federal Conservatives are women and voters age 55 and over. Neither of those groups is watching UFC or listening to Joe Rogan. And I think that's a problem. You're not growing your base. You're not trying to appeal to people who might be looking at you as a second choice. You're essentially saying, this is who we are and this is where we're going to take it. And it's going to be difficult for somebody who's worried about Donald Trump and voted Liberal to look at the federal Conservatives seriously again.
And so on the issue of Poilievre, is he pretty secure, do you think, in his leadership right now?
Well, it's a tricky one because caucus could actually decide, maybe not in the next few weeks or months, that they want to try something different. So there can be a leadership review initiated by caucus. And
20% of the caucus has to ask for it, is that it?
Yes, 20% of the caucus has to ask for it. And then you would have a leadership race if it is successful. Now, it's been a little bit weird because part of what is happening is the people who do not think that he's the one who should be leading the party are looking at the Liberals and saying, I'll join you. I think it would be something better for my community. Now, how these candidates are going to fare in the next election when they campaign as Liberals is still something that we don't know about. But I think it's a dangerous situation for the Conservatives because of the way in which the leadership review happened. It was almost like a lobbying. It was, here are all our friends, and we have all of the social media influencers.
And it's in Alberta, and Doug Ford was doing his thing in Ontario, so you couldn't say that everybody came to that meeting.
Well, I think that is also part of what makes this different. You know, there was a concerted effort in the federal Conservatives of the past to say, we are about the whole country. We're going to focus on doing something that benefits Atlantic Canada, BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. We need to do better in Quebec. And we didn't see a lot of this. We saw a lot of people who were very happy with Pierre Poilievre saying how happy they were with Pierre Poilievre and how dissatisfied they were with Mark Carney. And this isn't something that is going to be conducive to making those voters who voted for Mark Carney look at you differently.
So you've been looking at polls about leading politicians for forever. So I wonder if you can ever actually change your persona. So people say, okay, Poilievre, that didn't work with you being the little fighter out there, and so now just start being the nice guy. And first of all, I don't know that he could even do it, but I don't know if people would ever swallow that.
Well, it's tough to tell. I mean, you look at the way in which people react to former prime ministers, for instance, and we had that exercise just earlier this month, this idea of How do you feel about the best prime ministers and the worst prime ministers? And number one on the list of worst prime ministers was Justin Trudeau. 47% of Canadians said he gets one of my top 4 votes. If you had told me that in 2015, 2016,
right,
when he was riding high, when everybody was happy with him, when he was at the G7, it would have been hard to believe. So there's an opportunity for people to look at you and like everything about you. And then 2 months later, 6 months later, 3 years later, everything that you're doing, they hate. I think that is part of the problem here. You can grow that base. If there's a voter who is already a federal conservative, they're not going to go away if suddenly Pierre Poilievre wears more suits or behaves differently or stops lifting weights. I think that is part of what is required. We never saw a situation when Stephen Harper was the leader of the federal conservatives where he came out and said, Paul Martin is an ignorant about economic policy. You don't speak like that about a former finance minister. So for Pierre Poilievre to say that about Mark Carney, it appeals to the base. It's something that makes the social media influencers happy. But is it growing your support? No.
And it's ridiculous. Like, to say that this man is poorly educated on economics is, I thought Carney sort of responded the way I am. What?
Well,
like he said that?
It's not something that is going to help you. I think that is part of the problem. When you base your campaign on the way social media influencers are going to react, you're going to go negative, you're going to say things that you will probably regret. And it's not going to work because social media is not live. You have so many voters, so many female voters, so many voters 55 and over who are looking for content, who are looking for ways in which you're going to make their lives better. And your answer is to say the Prime Minister is ignorant about economic policy, a man who headed the Bank of Canada and the Bank of the UK? Okay.
But nobody believes it.
No, but and I think that's also part of it. There's this tendency, and we've seen it now creeping into the older generation, of this notion of everything is terrible, and social media helps me, galvanize that anger and show it to the world.
We'll continue this discussion after this break. A new player on the federal scene is Mr. Avi Lewis, New Democrat. Boy, does he seem extreme.
Well, it's a significant change from what we've seen in the past. I think part of what is happening with the NDP is people felt that Jagmeet Singh got just too cozy with Justin Trudeau. We're going to help this government continue in the minority scenario, provided that we get the pharmacare plan that we wanted and the dentist help that we wanted. The problem when we ask people about this is they were expecting something that was much more grandiose. And when you look at the actual status of these 2 plans, it's not something that really made everybody happy. So there's a look now inside the NDP of, okay, we need to be bolder. We need to have tougher ideas. We need to talk about, wealth redistribution and things that we haven't discussed so blatantly in the past. And I think that is why they're, trying to rebrand themselves. And it's always a tough exercise. We've seen it when Alexa McDonough stopped being the leader. We saw it when Tom Mulcair stopped being the leader. There's this redefinition that needs to happen with this party.
And so do you think, from your polling, that Canadians would be accepting of the extreme views that are being presented by Lewis?
Well, I think part of it is there might be a moment when, people react very well to the notion of something like this happening. Yes, to wealth redistribution. Yes, to ways in which you can tax, billionaires more. And we've seen other provincial parties moving towards that type of rhetoric. We're seeing it with the BC Greens here in BC. Now, how that is actually implemented when you don't have a majority in a legislature, that is what makes things more complicated. So at this point, it's not something that is going to lead anybody to believe that the NDP is going to have more seats than the Liberals or the Conservatives. They've only managed to form the official opposition once, and that was in 2011, with the weakest Liberal Party in history under Michael Ignatieff. Now, right now with Mark Carney, we're not having the weakest Liberal Party in history. It's the 3rd time that they form a government with the support of a large plurality of the voters in BC. So if they're trying to get some of those gains in BC, you need to turn Carney voters into Lewis voters, and that's going to be more complicated.
It seems to me more divisive, and I don't want to be copying the Americans, and I sure hope we aren't. But, we're getting some very extreme rights and now an extreme left. Is that where when you poll Canadians generally, do you see that?
No, everybody feels that like they're in the center. There's a tendency, some people are more center-right, and when you look at social conservatism, some people tend to be more center-left and say we need a better redistribution of wealth, but it's nothing that is going to compel everybody to say we need to move completely to the left or we need to move completely to the right. And that is what is causing some of the discrepancies from the people, because ultimately what happens is you want to vote for somebody who's going to form the government. And this is why the level of support for the minor parties keeps dropping, and also why you cannot find enough people who want to run as candidates. I think there's a good example of this in the People's Party of Canada. You know, the last election, they couldn't run a full slate because people don't want to find their names in Wikipedia for the rest of their lives as the person who finished in 5th or 6th place in a riding.
And it's hard to get people to want to run anyway with social media being so negative and, just even the discussions around the coffee shop. I'm hearing language that it surprised me. I came from Ontario years ago, Jason Robards, Bill Davis,
Yes.
Everything was polite, everything was calm. And I came out here and first time I ever heard a politician, Barrett called somebody a liar. And I
Yes.
went, what? You can't say that? You're saying that? And well, now we're so far beyond that.
Well, there's been a loss of decorum, and I think it starts in the legislature in a way. I've never been a fan of banging on desks. I think it's a terrible practice. We had a report issued just a few years ago from the speaker, Mr. Plekas, and he said, we need to do away with some of these situations. We don't want people banging on their desk. We don't want people behaving in this fashion. We are the lawmakers for the province, and we need to start behaving like it. And when I asked British Columbians, everybody loved the idea. But it's something that hasn't been ingrained in the current politicians. And I think that is part of the problem. Because of social media and the ability to have a 15-second soundbite everywhere on Twitter or on Facebook, you have people who are out there just going for the shock value of their statements. I think what we saw with Tara Armstrong last week exemplifies it beautifully.
And so there's Mr. Trump.
Always.
So now with our new majority Liberal government, how do people expect Mr. Carney to behave?
Well, I think he definitely benefits from that. I think there's a tendency from Canadians to look at this and say, we would be probably not better off if we had somebody else dealing with Donald Trump. Carney certainly has connected well with the base. What's interesting about his own rating is you have people who voted Conservative or who voted NDP who are telling us, I'm not voting Liberal in the next election, but I still believe that Carney is doing a fine job. So that is the essence of the argument for somebody who's going to be there trying to grow that base. But I think part of the challenge is Trump is not somebody who's really well liked. I mean, even in the first iteration, back in 2017, 2018, we had about 25-30% of Canadians, most of them conservatives, who said, it's a good idea. Let's see where Trump goes with this. I like this idea of ripping everything apart. And now that you have somebody like Robert F. Kennedy in Health and Human Services, all of the problems that they've had, all of the situations that have led to firings from the cabinet, the reaction from Canadians is, what is happening down there is not something that I'm happy with. And at least we got Mark Carney to take care of this. But the moment it all fell apart for Trump was the 51st state comments. That's when the Conservatives went, hold on a second, we never talk about something like this. I'm all about fiscal solvency and social issues, to a much lesser extent culture wars. But when you talk about annexing my country, that's where I draw the line. Now, most Canadians drew the line way before that, possibly after the Hollywood interview. But this is different now because the really tiny number of Canadians who thought Donald Trump was going to be beneficial has now completely disappeared.
And so here's the finance minister in me. When you poll, does anybody care about deficits anymore?
It's a great question because I think part of what happened, the pandemic made it a little bit easier to be okay with deficits. And it's a very different scenario than the one we had when I asked questions like this in, let's say, 2015, 2016. The notion of a debt, we're in a pandemic, it's tough, we'll manage it, and, thank you, government, for helping me out, thank you, government, for paying for all of these things, provincially, federally, municipally, whatever it was. If we go into deficit, so be it. And now it's a little bit different because we're way past the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think ultimately the governments that go into deficit need to have something to show for it. And that's been problematic. In places like Ontario, in Alberta, in BC, you have these significant deficits, and there's not a lot to show for it. So that is dangerous for the governments. It's not as if you're going to have a revolt against having a deficit. I don't think we're going to see that happening anytime soon. But it's definitely not something that is going to help you politically when the next election rolls around.
Oh, and the next government, boy, are they going to have a hard time trying to dig out of this hole.
Well, and I think we saw it back in 2024. John Rostad also campaigned on a deficit. It's not as if he was campaigning on something that was going to work perfectly from day one. Part of the complexity here is what are you going to cut? What are you going to touch? What are you not going to fund as much as you used to? And I think this is why the last budget was such a calamity for the NDP. Like, there was nothing to dangle in front of their base and say, I know we're doing sacrifices, but we're funding these things that you care about. It's way more complicated than that.
So what's the one question you'd like to get out there and poll right now?
Right now, I'm interested in the way we evolve in the case of participation in politics. One thing that I've always been curious about is, should we make voting mandatory? I've asked that question in the past. But now that you're really looking into the actual connotations of a vote, when you look at what happened in the United States, when you see Democrats who told you 3 days after the election, I just really wasn't that keen on Kamala Harris, so I stayed home and watched TV. Or, you look at a place like Australia where voting is mandatory and you have an opportunity to say, we need to go out there and cast a ballot all the time. Like, we spend a lot of time and effort looking into reforming the system, but we don't spend a lot of time and effort figuring out ways to get more Canadians to participate in politics, especially municipally where the turnout rates are dismal.
Okay, Mario, so once you go out there and get that poll, come back and talk to us about it.
I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Back in a moment. What an interesting time to try and read the tea leaves of politics in Canada. BC is in chaotic disarray. The two provinces, Alberta and Quebec, are playing around the edges of separatism, and Ontario, well, it's Ontario. And federally, we have a new government with huge expectations on its back, especially in dealing with the mercurial President Trump. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.